Welcome to EPI's Launch Your Classroom. I'm Kyle Pope, a former high school social studies teacher.
I'm Kristina, a former elementary school teacher.
Thank you for joining us today. In this session, we're going to be talking about assessments, how they help to monitor your students' progress, how they can help you inform your own instruction, and how you can use that assessment data to plug in for grades. Grading is
Absolutely.
hugely important,
Yeah.
so we're going to be talking about that today. Kristina, could you tell us, why do we assess?
Yeah. So imagine having a class that you taught but never assessed. Would you know where your students are as a group and as individuals? Would you be able to understand who got the mark and who passed and who got all of the content and who needs additional help or practice? Would you be able to, without assessments, tell a principal or tell a parent, especially where their child is, in that content area or in your class? So assessments are really crucial to be able to, give that data and tell us where our students fall on how successful and how much they know and what we need to do to get them there.
Absolutely. So, where do we start with assessments?
Yeah, so I feel like assessment should be done successfully and implemented every day. So you should make sure that you are assessing your students on a daily basis, either formatively or with summatively, and also making sure that you are thinking about where you're going to start your
Mm,
content. So not only in the lesson plans themselves, but also even before, when you start planning and thinking about how to plan that lesson, you want to think about where your students are going to be in that content knowledge at that moment.
yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, coming into these and having that pre-planning is absolutely necessary, especially when you want to do pre-assessments.
Exactly. Can
And
you tell us more about those?
yeah, when you want to gauge, where are your students at? When you
Yeah.
need to find out what they know
Yeah.
already. So, if you need to go back and maybe review some knowledge
Yeah.
that you thought they might have already, or if you can just go ahead and build upon,
Yeah.
what they already know. So, pre-assessments are definitely something that you want to plan far enough
Mhm.
in advance and give to the students far enough in advance so you can have time to kind of crunch the data
Yeah.
before you get into your total lesson planning, or else you may end up having to go back and change it all.
Yeah.
We're going to show you a quick example of one called an entry ticket. Now,
Yes.
this is a very quick, simple thing you can do. As students come into the classroom, you can have the entry ticket. You can either hand them out as
Absolutely.
they walk
Mhm.
in and greet each student name by name, then just have them answer the question, and it can, be that quick review or quick activation of knowledge, and then
Absolutely.
kind of let you judge where they're at. So once you have that, you have to take it, you have to analyze
Mhm.
it, you have to process it. You have to determine then where you need to start in your content.
Absolutely.
Um, as far as like going further into regular assessments, looking at
Mhm.
the end of it, we looked at the verse, look at the end of summative. You got to take those questions that you get from your summative and look at them, even itemize, and say, do the students pass this one? Do most get this question right?
Mhm.
Do most of them fail it? And then you kind of need to look back at your own instructional abilities, saying, maybe I didn't teach this one right because 90% of the students got it wrong. Either
Absolutely.
that or there could be something wrong with your question and the way that
Mhm.
you asked it. So, just start self diagnosing at that point.
Absolutely.
But regardless, if that's content that you're building on that they are going to need to know, it's something that you will need to reteach and revisit later on to make sure that they have that understanding.
Yeah.
So when you get that data, also in addition, it can help you form your groups. We talked about having groups of mixed abilities.
Mhm.
How do you know what those abilities are if you
Mhm.
don't have that assessment
Exactly. Yeah.
data? So it can help you decide how to pair people or who to put in which group. Um, it can also help you with your differentiation.
Mhm.
On the lesson plan that we had you guys go over, you can see that you always need something for the high
Mhm.
achievers, you always need something for those struggling learners,
Mhm.
and this will give you that data to tell you which category these students may belong in.
Mhm.
So with that differentiation, you know, don't think of it as more work if you're thinking for your
Right.
your stronger students, but something a little bit more engaging, those
Deep
add-on
dive.
extension activities that we
Yeah.
talked about. For your struggling learners, differentiation could be something as simple as allowing them to write in bullet points instead of writing out like a full essay or something like that, especially if they're struggling with language learning and this type of acquisition idea. So they're still ultimately going to meet the same goals with this differentiation, right?
Right.
But it's just a different method of how to
Right.
get there.
And also with those, and to go along with what you were saying, Kyle, it's also great. And I know you mentioned questions, so the question type also matters. So there should be in that grade, and on those assessments, generally a variety of question types. Maybe you'll have some multiple choice, or maybe you'll have some open ended and things like that, to give them the opportunity to kind of answer in a variety of methods and use different parts of their brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Reading comprehension type
Exactly.
questions, even matching those
Hmm.
types of, yeah, just have a variety in there. Good. So now that we have some idea of the assessments that we're using,
Yeah.
how do we grade those?
So with grades, obviously grades are going to be impacted by your assessments, because your assessments will lead to what kind of grades that you're seeing come out of your classroom. So you're going to want to make sure to understand what you're grading, what is going to end up being a grade in your grade book, and how to go about doing that. So kind of pivoting onto some grades and grade information a little bit, thinking about how to do your assessments and in regards to grades. So, what I always like to do was when I was doing, for instance, I would do pre-assessments, and like you said, give yourself enough time to take that pre-assessment data, digest it, and use it for your planning. But you never want to grade, the pre-assessment information as a part of your grade, right? Because
Right.
you only want to grade and you only want to assess for things that you have taught in your
Mhm.
classroom. So if it's something that you're trying to see where their information is and maybe what content that they have, you don't want to grade that, because that would be just unfair to the student. You want to give them the opportunity to learn that information in your class and present it to see, assess them on what you've taught them. So, thinking also about grades is that they are required,
Mhm.
right? It's very important to make sure that you're turning in your grades on time. Most schools do have some kind of gradebook system or grading system. I know that we use something called Power School. You might be familiar with that. So, make sure that if you do not know of your grading system, that you go ahead and ask now. And you can ask your office staff,
Media
your
coordinator.
media coordinator, and also as well as your grade level, if you have
Mhm.
people in your grade level that have been there and have experience with that. So you'll definitely make sure you're wanting to turn in those grades, and you're wanting to make sure that you have enough grades. So how many grades did you usually have a week for
I
your
tried to have
students?
at least 4
Hmm.
entered per week. And what I did was I said every Thursday I'm going to have my grades for the previous week
Hmm.
entered by this time.
So you had a strategy for when to enter your grades.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it gave me that cutoff point, and I made it pretty rigid in my head
Yes.
that this is when I have to have it in there.
Yes.
You don't want to get too backed up in your grade book, or else you end up saying, "Oh, I don't have to grade that," when it should be something that you should have, or you end up with a ton to grade at
Hmm.
one time. If you know you're a middle or high school teacher, you're teaching different classes throughout the day, so it's
Absolutely.
it's very possible that you have over 100 students.
Oh,
And if you
yes.
think of having to grade that amount of stuff,
At one
say you had
time. Or
10 that you needed to put in or something, I
yeah.
mean, you're getting into the thousands
Hmm.
at this point of things that you need to grade. So,
Hmm.
just trying to manage that, trying to set yourself
Hmm.
a goal that you're going to achieve to get
Yeah.
them in by a certain time. It'll just help you stay on top of things.
Yeah, absolutely. You should also be utilizing those grades for assessment, yourself and your own lesson plans and what you're using that data for. So having, a huge backlog of
Mhm.
stuff to grade is not only efficient or inefficient for you all, but it also doesn't help actually be able to take that data from those assessments and use it as important data. And if you don't use the data that you are collecting, then it just becomes just a test that you're giving them. It's not meaningful. So assessments should always make sure you make assessments meaningful. There should be a reason why you're giving that assessment, and then utilize that data again, for what that needs to be. So think about also with grades. I want to touch on the fact that grades need to reflect all of the growth happening in your classroom. So it does not do well for your students if you only grade the assessments. So you make sure you're grading your assessments, but also include other grades. You can use different work grades from your class work grades, and make sure that you're including enough to really get the broad scope of that student's learning. You can also do, participatory grades. So you have the ability to use, participation grades as a way to get that behavior in there and to help out those students, although maybe they're not good, the best test takers. So maybe they get, nervous or have trouble taking tests, but when in all of their other content, they work really hard and they try really hard, and you can use that participatory grade to really show that, and really give them the grade that you know that they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the 4 grades that I entered every week,
Absolutely.
because, you should reward those students who are really trying hard, who are really putting forth a lot of effort, even though that their other grades may not reflect it. You know that they are trying, sometimes the best of
Yes.
their ability. And so for participation, for me, what I would do is I would give them 20 points a day,
Mhm.
and that they could earn. And if
Mhm.
they were working on their assignments, if they were following their
Yeah.
procedures and rules, and they were working hard, then they got full 20 for that day.
Mhm.
And by the end of the week, they
Get
would
up to
have 100.
100.
So,
Mhm. Great. And so I also want to touch on that uh, with grades, and make sure not only are you turning them in, but you understand that if you give a child or a student, excuse me, any grade, that you need to be expected to back up whatever grade that you gave them. So, for instance, if you have a student that has not passed a test or not passed an assessment, you need to know exactly why that student didn't pass those assessments, and you need to make sure that you're offering and giving them the ability to to grow and to change those, what their knowledge is. So I also like to, if they did get a non-passing grade, to give them the ability to kind of make that up, or give them opportunities for growth there,
yeah.
especially with parents. It's very important that you can back up any grade that you give them, because when those report cards go home, it's very important that those grades reflect the full student.
Yeah, when you get into the older students, sometimes you'll have those that think that they can make up anything and try to take advantage of you in a way to
Hmm.
where they don't mind if they fail an assignment or something because they know you're going to give them another chance, which you should give them another
Hmm.
chance, but make them invest into it a little bit
Exactly.
more. For me, I made them write a 1-page
Hmm.
paper explaining to me why I should allow them to retake it. And a lot of the times the kids would opt not to write the paper at all, and therefore they didn't get a chance to retake it. So,
Right.
you know, make them invest in it. Don't make it just be an
Hmm.
easy thing, oh, well, I failed, I can take it again. Well,
Yeah.
yes, that's true, but you've got to do an additional step at this point.
Yeah.
So add into it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Well, thank you. I just want to, before we wrap, and I see all these questions coming in that we really want to take a look at and make sure that we get to some of those. But I do want to go and think about how your assessments are going to go in your class, how they're going right now. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us, but make sure that you are doing those assessments and that you're really using that data to impact what you're going to do in the future in your class.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. We're going to get to the questions now.
Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks so much for watching and for the great questions we've been getting in the chat, our social media channels, and email. We will answer as many as we can today. Joining us for the Q&A is the host of Launch Your Classroom Live, Kyle Pope, and former educator and director of EPI Program Services, Ryan Hennessy. All right, let's take a look at our first question. James writes, when you said that teachers should do assessments every day, does that mean both formative and summative assessments? Ryan, what do you think?
It's a great question. Thanks, James, and Kyle, thanks for having me back. So James, I think what we need to remember here is that assessments, it's a different term than tests, right? So if we think of it that way, you can absolutely do assessments every day, but it does not mean that you need to do both formative and summative assessments every day. When I think summative assessment, I think test, right, of some kind. It's a final. You're going to see what someone has learned throughout the whole course of study. But that said, with formative assessments, I would think you would want to work that in every day. In fact, it would be best practice. As long as you're teaching, you have a need to know what they've learned, and that would require an assessment. So James, yes on the formative, probably not on the summative. Thanks.
Okay, our next question comes from Angelica. Can assessment data be misleading? Kyle?
Angelica, thank you. That's a very good question. So I think what's more apt to happen is that your interpretation of the data may be misleading. And this can come sometimes when maybe your assessment wasn't structured, in a way to really hit that objective, to really tell if the student had accomplished what you wanted them to. And that's sometimes that when you see data and you're like, well, I taught this exactly like I wanted to, but the product doesn't look what I expect it to be. Maybe your assessment wasn't designed well enough to test that specific knowledge. Other times, maybe it's just that, it was an off day, or the way that you decided to teach it didn't really speak to the students and didn't engage them on that particular subject. So I would suggest if you come across an assessment or a question on an assessment that doesn't seem right, that you try to put it to them with the same knowledge but in a different type of assessment and see what your results in, and that'll help you problem shoot whether it was your assessment or whether it was just that the students didn't learn what you tried to teach them the first time. Thank you.
All right, Tamia writes in to say, I am really behind on my grading. Is there something I can do to catch up? Ryan, you ever been there?
I have absolutely been there. Tamila, I feel your pain. So I'm going to answer this in two parts. Really, in my experience, there's two ways to get behind on grading. Number one is that you're getting so much that so much work from the students' products and things, you don't really know what's worth grading and what isn't, and you get a big pile. So in the pile effect, the only way to get the grades is to retroactively go back and look at the ones that are the most useful compared to the content you're teaching. Schedule yourself some time every day and just get through it. Now, what I think you probably meant here, though, is that you maybe don't have grades, maybe a couple tests, and is there something you can do to get more grades? In this case, I would suggest one of my most favorite assessment strategies, and that is a portfolio strategy. So maybe in the next unit that you teach before the report period, have the students do a portfolio of work from the beginning of instruction to the end. And usually in that, you can probably get multiple grades out of that portfolio, and their learning is not all hinged on one summative assessment. So maybe give that a try.
All right, Judine writes and says, what are some factors that I can use to determine participation? Kyle, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up participation. It's one of my favorite things because so many times we get caught up in, those summative assessments and those final products and grading those, and we never give student credit for hard work or effort, and that's definitely what goes into participation. So when you're looking at participation, you're looking at, are they completing the formative assessments, even the ones that you aren't grading? Are they completing those pre-assessments? Are they raising their hand to answer questions in class? Are they participating with their group? Are they allowing to give them answers? Are they just in general being active in the class? Those are the perfect things to use for participation. So thank you once again for that question.
Thanks, Kyle. Benjamin writes to say, I have a parent who is not happy with their student's grade, and they seem to be blaming me. What should I say to them? Ryan, what do we do in a situation like this?
Well, Benjamin, the first thing you have to do is you have to say something. Parent communication is really important. And even if you're feeling unsure of yourself, call them, have them come in and partner with them. That's always the best strategy. Now, to the actual meat of the question, which is the parent isn't happy with the student grade, and you're feeling some blame from them. What I would do is, first of all, I would go through and pull all of the samples of work, the large assessments, the summatives, but not only that. Any artifact of learning, any observations that you've made, and I'd lay them out. You don't need to get too into standards and rubrics because the average parent probably isn't going to really attune to that the way a teacher would. But what you can say is, here is what proficient should look like on this assessment. Here is what a passing grade would have looked like for this given assignment. And these are the reasons that I took points from this student's work, because you can see they're not meeting the goals here, here, and here. Now, Benjamin, after you've done that, a very, very good touch that's going to help with that partnership would be to say, what can you and I do? What can I do to help you, and you can help us to get your student up to this mark? Because that is going to change conversation to something far more useful for that child. Thanks.
That's some great advice, Ryan. Up next, we've got Carla, who wants to know, how can I keep my students from coming up to me right before report cards to ask how to improve their grades? Kyle?
Thank you, Carla. So I think the first thing that you need to do is make them aware of what your makeup policy is, or your policy to redo work. Be very upfront with that and let them know, when they get a bad grade, the procedures that they should go through. But I think one of the biggest things that impacts grades, at least from what I used to see as a teacher, would be students not turning in an assignment. Those zeros really impact averages. So what I did was I kept folders with each of my students' names on it. They all knew where they were in a file in the front of the class, and that's where I put all their missing work. I told them that, the work was in there. I had a certain date that I had to have my grades in by, and if they wanted to make sure to knock out those zeros, then they could go at the folders at any time, complete that work, and then turn it in directly to me, and that would be the best thing that they could do for their grades. So I think as long as you're open and you keep an open dialogue about your procedures for makeup work and miss work, those are going to be the two that have the heaviest impact on grades, and that's what the students will be able to do to bring those grades up. So thank you so much, Carla.
All right, Edward writes to say, what if my students give me the answers which are unable to be graded according to the grading marking criteria? What can I do? Sticky situation. What do you think, Ryan?
Absolutely a sticky situation. Edward, I've been right there with you. And I guess it depends where the grading or marking criteria are coming from. I'd say today most schools and districts are doing a lot of common assessments, which means we as teachers don't have a lot of room to alter that grading and marking criteria, because the entire district and subject is being held to that assessment style and that rubric. So one of the things that I might suggest is, if you are looking at a student's answer or performance, and you look at the criteria for that item, and you see that you are not going to be able to give this student a passing mark or a proficient mark on that item, what you can do is you can mark it as such for the rubric and enter that information so that the data is useful for comparison in common assessment. However, your grade on the test does not necessarily have to hinge on the rubric. Remember, the point of the rubric is to get the assessment data that you will use to judge proficiency. If that student has shown outstanding performance in that item, or they got it halfway correct, You can reflect that in your own grade without having to reflect that in the rubric. The rubric and the grade for your case can be separate. If that doesn't help you, I would suggest do this. When we make an assessment and the marking criteria, we must identify gaps. Where's the assessment itself not perfect? If this is a district assessment, reach out to your curriculum coach. Ask them to sit down and look at those marking criteria. You may have found a place where the assessment can be improved. So great question, Edward.
Thanks, Ryan. Now, Ahmed wants to know, are there any new assessment tools? They've been using Quizlets, Kahoot, Educanon, and Edmodo. Any secrets up your sleeve, Kyle?
Yeah, Ahmed, it seems like you're really interested in the technology type assessment tools, and that's wonderful. So one that I saw missing from your list is one called Quiz-Is, and we can actually spell that for you in chat in a couple minutes if you can't understand exactly what I'm saying. But in addition to that, there are a lot of assessment tools that are based upon like popular TV game shows. You can find stuff online to make your own Jeopardy game, to make a Wheel of Fortune, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. All those types of shows have those types of assessments that you can build in and customize if you just search for them online. In addition to that, you know, if you use Google and Google Classroom, you can do much quicker assessments where you can just ask one direct question to your students. You can make it open-ended. You can have it to be multiple choice, but that's something that could give you a very quick view. I love to use them for a review personally, especially for a warm-up of class when they first came in, checking to see who remembered what we talked about the day before. So those are just some examples of other types of internet technology assessments that you can use. Thank you.
Up next, we've got Bismarck, who wants to know how much in percentage is assessing items for testing for knowledge, application, and critical thinking in the U.S. Ryan?
Bismarck, great question. I think it's important here to mention first, before the answer, that the United States does not currently have a nationalized curriculum or grading scale, meaning across the states and the districts, and even sometimes right down to the school. Percentages of assessment items and tests and testing those things that you've mentioned there on the screen, they vary. So we don't have a set percentage. That said, Bismarck, let me give you my best answer on this. Critical thinking should be where you want students to spend 90 or a vast majority of time in formative informal assessments. If you are doing a summative test, which is maybe a multiple choice, short answer, just pure, what do you remember and know, you want to make sure you get that knowledge and some application. Now, if you choose to use a performance or an authentic assessment for a summative indication of growth, you can bump that critical thinking and especially that application up. Have the students apply the skill, have them do an exhibition of the skill, have the students write an essay with a lot of hows and whys. The research says the more time a student spends in critical thinking is more time that they're going to expand their current body of knowledge or schema on a given topic. Great question, Bismarck.
Thanks, Ryan. Our next question comes from Alicia, and she wants to know, on a monthly basis, I grade my students' individual notebooks so as to improve penmanship and encourage responsibility re-note-taking and how worksheets are treated. Is this okay?
Yeah, and I really like that you're doing this to hold the students accountable for that note-taking. And if I'm correct, Alicia, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think you're an elementary school teacher, so this becomes an extremely important thing for them to do when they get into middle school and when they get into high school. So for you teaching them that responsibility now is so very important. So yeah, absolutely, you should go ahead, check that, use it as a grade. And then you can even put it under something as a note-taking, or if you want to lump it into something like a participation grade, that would be fine too. But yeah, you're absolutely doing the right thing, so thank you.
All right, our next question comes in from Langaman Ligaya, and they want to know, hello, how can I best record my assessment of my kindergarten pupils? Right away, in every subject, every meeting. What do you think?
Thanks, Lagaman Ligaya. This question is close to my heart. I think, as was mentioned, I am a former elementary school teacher, and the kindergarten pupils, it's now more than ever, there is more emphasis being put on growth and achievement academically in the kindergarten age and in that classroom. So you're right. That's a challenge. How do we record assessment? How do we do it? And how do we make sure we're getting the right data right away, as you say, in every subject, every meeting? I'm going to suggest that for that age group, you can be engaging and you can get the data you need from authentic assessments. All right, and I mentioned this before, but there's two here that I think you may find allow you the flexibility, and they're quick. One way, and I really love this kind of assessment, it's called an interview, right? So just like you would do that you see maybe on the news, you sit down with a student or a group of students and you have some very targeted questions relating to your goals and your content, and you ask them and let them give you a verbal response, and you can make a very simple system. Check if they're meeting goal, X or minus if they need some help, whatever you want. But for the kindergartners, you can make it really engaging. Get yourself, make a microphone out of a pencil, put on a silly hat that says news anchor, and they're going to give you those answers. Another great way, I mentioned the portfolio. If you're teaching a unit, give them a folder or something like that and have them do various ways to show knowledge. You could do collage, you could have essays, you could have drawings, all kinds of ways for the students to demonstrate that they have that knowledge even when they may not be able to write or to the point that you could grade it. So great question, good luck.
All right, Kyle, our final question today comes from Midoriya. What would you do if a student doesn't participate, but they do their work individually?
So thank you for this question. And what I'm gathering is that you're asking about whether you should give them, what type of grade you should give them for participation. Maybe they're a quiet student or shy or don't particularly like working in groups or something of that nature. So participation can really vary. How do they participate? If they are doing their work individually and they are turning in every single assignment you give them, even if you aren't necessarily taking a grade on it, that's a form of participation right there, that they are participating within the class. Something that I think is really important to note here is that the weight that you put on the participation grade, in general, it should probably be a little bit more lower than your formative assessments and definitely lower than your summative assessments. So if a student doesn't necessarily reach 100% on their participation grade, it's not something that's going to hurt them dramatically for their entire grade. So this is also a situation where you can kind of speak to the student aside and say, like, give them a gentle reminder and be like, hey, I really appreciate you turning in all your grades and all your assessments, and this is definitely going towards your grade and your participation. But, we also want to hear your voice. I want to hear what you have to say in class. Is there something I can do to help you do that? Is there a subject that you particularly want to talk on that I can bring up? Anything that you can kind of do to help this student feel more comfortable speaking in your class and participating more on the whole. So thank you very much.
All right, I'd like to thank Kyle and Ryan for joining us for the Q&A today. That's all the questions we have time for. Please join us back here next week, October 19th at 4 p.m. Eastern for the next episode of Launch Your Classroom Live. We will be exploring the technique for building rapport at the classroom door. To get the most out of next week's episode, read Chapter 3 in your Launch Your Classroom handbook. If you don't already have a copy of Launch Your Classroom, follow the link in the description below to purchase Volume 1, Building a Foundation for Learning. As a special thank you to our audience, we are offering 2 free download days for the Volume 1 ebook on October 15th and 19th. Remember, to stay up to date on all the new episodes of Launch Your Classroom Live, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications when we're live. We'll see you next time.